We now come on to the very important matter of planning and implementation. Planning is probably the most important tool in the administrator's armoury. If you are not a planner, you probably are not an administrator, because planning is all about looking into the future and seeing where it is that you're going, how you're going to get there, and then implementing the steps along that path to reach the goal, which of course involves mobilizing people, obtaining resources, booking equipment, and so on. And so we're going to start with just setting some goals for ourselves. First of all, I want to equip you in this session with helping you appreciate the place of responsible planning, but without eliminating the work of the Spirit. It's so important that we do not think that planning is a very human process only. No, it's a partnership with the Holy Spirit. In Proverbs 16:3 it says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established." Notice it is your works and your plans. And that as we submit them to the Lord, so they will be established. So I want you to see that responsible planning does not exclude the work of the Spirit. Next, I want to bring some very practical suggestions to help you plan, and this will be the bulk of the talk that we're going to share over this session and the next. And finally, some guidelines to implement plans and to bring accountability. So first of all, let's look at the different types of planning that we are talking about. First of all, there is the personal planning, the time management side, the making the best use of your time. If you don't know how to organize your own time, it's very difficult to help you organize a bigger event or a bigger ministry that involves lots of other people's times. So the whole idea of setting priorities, of getting those priorities in the right order, of being disciplined in carrying them through, these are vital aspects of personal discipline, personal time management on a daily, weekly basis. Next, there is the planning that goes towards a particular event. We looked at Jesus feeding the 5,000. That was an event. And you remember how we saw that it had time boundaries as well as geographical boundaries to it. So the way you plan towards a particular event is different from the way that you plan towards a ministry. A ministry is much more open-ended. It's going to go on and on. What starts today will maybe run for a year. We'll then review it, adjust it, and let it run for another year, and so on. So a ministry essentially is something that goes on through time. It isn't something that just has a particular moment in time. When it's taken place, the event is over, you can look back on it and talk about it as a historical happening. I define planning in this way. It's anticipating an event or situation and ordering the steps to achieve it. That's what administration is all about. It's looking down the line to a particular goal or a particular set of circumstances and then ordering the steps to get there in a logical, organized way, not random, but something that catches people up in it at the right moment. In other words, as we saw when we were talking about making the best use of your time, it's about writing history in advance. You look ahead, see the event, whatever it may be, maybe a special outreach service in your church, maybe a big conference, and you anticipate what that event will look like, you anticipate how it's going to run, and you then work back from that end point so that you're, as it were, writing the history towards that before you even have it. And so it is writing your history in advance, anticipating an event or situation and ordering the steps to achieve it. See, Jesus was very intentional in all that he did. And it says in Luke 9 and verses 51-52, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. That was very intentional. The disciples tried to discourage him. They tried to discourage Paul similarly. But no, he set his face. He knew where he was going, and he was determined to be there. And he sent his messengers ahead of him, who went and entered the village, a village of Samaritans, to make preparation for him. And so he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. He sends those who are with him in advance, and then he carries out the plan that is in his mind. So why do we plan? Well, there are a number of reasons for doing this. First of all, it greatly increases the efficiency. What do we mean by efficiency? Well, efficiency is essentially using resources well. It's using finances well. It's using time well. It's using people well. I remember once being involved in a church building in Africa, and I went to visit this building when it was partly completed. We had helped with some of the finances, and having looked around and seen the building, I then said, "Oh, could I have a look at the plans?" And they looked at me amazed. "But we haven't finished the building yet." And I said, no, but plans are about what you're going to build and then fulfilling them. "Oh no, in our country we build a building and then we draw the plans and submit those to the authorities," was the response. Well, that's not planning at all. And I know that in that building, for instance, they built the toilets in one corner of the building, and then at a later stage, because they didn't quite know where they were going, they decided to move them. That's a very inefficient way of using time, materials, money, people. That's not efficient. Using time well, using people well, using finance well, those are some of the measures that determine whether you're being efficient. And effectiveness. It's very important when planning to know not only what the event is, but what the outcomes are that are expected. Because you don't want to just run a big conference without having any goals in mind, without having any idea what you're hoping to gain from that conference. Well, the same is true of even your Sunday service. I often pray before a Sunday service, "Lord, accomplish what you have in mind and reveal that to us." So that as we go through a Sunday service, we are making sure that the benefits that God has in mind are being realized. Obviously, it's to glorify Him, but also to teach people, also to minister to people so that they are benefiting from the gifts of the Spirit being exercised through their brothers and sisters. Maybe for healing, maybe for salvation, maybe for baptism of the Spirit. And so we want to be sure that there are some defined goals ahead of us, because only then can we know whether what we're doing is ultimately effective. And that's going to be very important when we come on to talking about monitoring and evaluation. Next, we plan because it helps with team building. If you have a plan at the beginning of a process towards an event or ministry, you can then mobilize all the people that are going to be involved in fulfilling that plan. And by bringing them in early, you get ownership. They become involved. They will start thinking about the ministry, the event themselves. And maybe we'll be bringing some good ideas which will enhance the value of the whole event. And so it helps with team building. And then as you gather the team from time to time leading up to the event, that again creates something of a cohesion amongst them, because each person knows what the other is doing, what the other is thinking. Above all, knows what the leader of that team is thinking and aiming for, so that they can bring their own particular skills to bear in the way that is most appropriate for the fulfillment of the event and for the effectiveness of the outcomes. And then it gives a framework to monitor progress. We'll look a little bit later about having a timeline as we move forward towards an event, but if you know what the plans are towards that event, you can know how you're getting on. You can monitor, have preparations been made in such and such an area? Has the venue been booked, and so on? If you've thought through all those details right at the start of the process, then you can monitor progress. It's like going on a journey, isn't it? From time to time, it's good just to check that you're going through the towns that you expect to go when you're driving up to Abuja, perhaps. And if you're not going through the right towns, it makes you think, oh, have I taken a wrong turning somewhere? So you monitor progress to just give you that reassurance that you're on course, on track, going in the right direction, within the right time scale, and so on. Now, there are various building blocks as we plan that we want to set in place. First of all, we need to know where we're going. You don't just set out randomly from Lagos and drive in any old direction thinking, well, I don't know where I'm going, but we'll just go for a drive. No, that would just be foolish. You say, no, we want to drive from Lagos to Abuja. We know where we're going. We know what our goal is. It's a specific city. Next, how are we going to get there? Sometimes when I'm talking about planning and use the imagery of a journey, I ask people to think of how many different ways they could actually make that journey. You could do it on foot, you could do it on a bicycle, do it in a car, do it on roller skates, do it by air, do it on horseback. There are many different ways that you could achieve that goal. All of them would get you to the destination, but the process and the time scale will vary hugely. If you're flying, you won't see any of the countryside. If you're going on horseback, you'll enjoy the countryside, but you'll take a long, long time. And so you need to know what is the appropriate way of travel for the particular task that you are setting out on. Next, well, what resources do we have? When we talked about event management and seeing Jesus as a model of that event management, you remember how he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish and he said, Father, these are the resources I have. Will you multiply them? He recognized that those 5 loaves and 2 fish were not adequate, but they were what he had. By defining the resources that we have and what we need, we can then identify how we fill that gap. Are we going to have to go and buy something? Are we going to have to hire something? Are we going to have to compromise somewhere because we don't have the budget to be able to fulfill this event in quite the way that we'd ideally like? So the needs maybe have to be modified. But if we never stop and assess the resources, both what we need and what we have, we're going to probably end up by spending a lot of money and probably end up by rushing around at the last moment looking for resources that we had not thought of. It's almost inevitable that as you come up to a big event, there will be a little bit of that happening anyhow. But try to minimize it because it really adds stress to everyone who's involved. If you're all the time saying, oh, go and get this or go and get that, we should have thought of this earlier, that just brings stress to your team. And that's not a good way to go into an event with a stressed team. You want them relaxed, peaceful, that everything that they should have done has been done, and the confidence that that's happened with their colleagues as well. And then the timeline. When is the event going to take place? What are the various steps in order to bring that about? We need to have a clearly defined timeline, and we'll look at that a little bit later. And finally, monitoring and evaluation. What is the right route? What's the best route to get from here to there? If you're traveling on a journey, you look at a map and you decide whether you're going to take the fastest route or whether you're going to take the most scenic route, whether there are any roadblocks along the way that you want to avoid. You look at all sorts of things to decide what's the most appropriate route for achieving what we're trying to do. And you look at that, you think about it, you prepare for it, and then you set out. Where are you going to stop for a break, for a meal, and so on. So far we've just had a look at planning and saying that good planning is about writing your history in advance, knowing where you're going and deciding what are the steps that you want to put in place to get there. When you have got there, you can look back on the journey you've made and see that you've made the appropriate steps, that you've got there on time, that you've got there in good condition, that the vehicle is still running, whatever that vehicle might be. And then planning leads to greater effectiveness. We've seen how if you're going to plan well, that will produce the most effective outcome. But you must know what those outcomes are. So define the outcomes at the beginning, not just the event, but the purpose of the event at the beginning, so that you can achieve most effectively the outcomes you want. And now we're going to look at a planning model in the Bible. In many places in the Bible you find big situations taking place. You'll remember that Joseph, he was used to store up corn for 7 years in order to be able to then distribute it for the next 7 years of famine. A lot of planning must have gone into that. Warehouses, sacks, labour, how are you going to monitor people coming and going? How are you going to keep records of the people who've come to pick up food so that when they come the next time you know who they've been and how long ago it is, so you're not in double distribution and so on. And of course that was the case with his brothers. He had a record of when they'd been before and when they came back again. So there are lots of examples, but I'm going to help you plan by looking at the Nehemiah plan. You're probably familiar with the story of Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, working hand in hand with Ezra the prophet. And he had a heart to rebuild Jerusalem. He was a man in exile. He was with his compatriots a long way away from Jerusalem. And then he was visited by his brothers who told him that Jerusalem was broken down. And Nehemiah found a stirring in his heart to rebuild that city. Let's just have a look at the context first of all. In 597 BC, Jerusalem was captured and the people, the residents, were taken to Babylon, a distance of 500 or 600 kilometers, modern day Baghdad in Iraq. And then Persia came from the east and they captured the Babylonians, and some of the refugees were captured at the same time. Now this was 60 years or so after the original captivity, but there would have been people who had come from Jerusalem, but of course 1 or 2 generations who would have grown up in exile, who would know nothing about Jerusalem. And they were taken further east into modern-day Iran, to Susa in Persia. But they weren't all taken there. Some returned to Jerusalem at that stage. And when they returned, they got permission from Cyrus, the king, to rebuild the temple, to start rebuilding the temple. And you find that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, for instance, in the Old Testament, they prophesy around this period about the rebuilding of the temple in that era. And then in 464, Artaxerxes allowed the rebuilding to start again because it had been stopped. There had been opposition. But Artaxerxes showed favor towards them and he allowed the building to restart. And then after 7 years or so, he allowed self-government to take place, that within Jerusalem they could set up their own form of government. But then 3 years later, the Samaritans reported to Artaxerxes some false reports. And the result was that he stopped the building of the city. And indeed, the Samaritans came and they destroyed much of what had been built. And so we get to the year 444, when Nehemiah is visited by his brothers in Susa. They've come all the way from Jerusalem, which is a long way, 1,000 kilometers or so. And they come to Susa and they tell him the situation. If we just have a look at the geography, you can see there in the center of the picture, you've got Jerusalem, and then you've got Babylon, the modern day Baghdad, and further east still, you've got Susa in modern day Iran. And so what is the Nehemiah plan? Well, first of all, he defined the goal. He found in his heart a vision developing. Let's just read some of these verses in chapter 1 and verse 4 of the book of Nehemiah. It says, "Now it came about when I heard these words," those were the words of his brother Hanani, who had come back and told him that the walls were burnt down. He said, "I sat down and wept and mourned, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." And I believe that as he did that, a dream formed in his mind, a vision came to his mind, and we see something about that in the next chapter, in verse 5 of chapter 2, where he said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Now, through chapter 1, it essentially is a time of prayer and fasting and waiting on God. He repents for the former sins of his people. It is, remember, about 150 years since the original captivity, so it is highly likely he had never himself been to Jerusalem. But of course, as in so many cultures, home for the Jew is Jerusalem, even if they've never been there. And just as in Africa, there's that reference back to the family village, the tribal village that people have originated from. That's what home is. That's often where, when they're dead, their bodies are taken back for burial, even though they may never have lived there themselves. So there's that deep-seated sense of history, of roots back into a homeland that may be not in the experience of the present day, but nevertheless is kind of built into the thinking and the emotion. And so Nehemiah clearly had a real sense of Jerusalem being important and wanted to play his part. And so as he's praying, as he's repenting before God, as he's crying in fasting and prayer, so this vision forms in his heart. I would like to go back and rebuild that city. So what happens next? Well, he then starts to develop a strategy to do so. So he's now set his goal, he now knows where he's wanting to go, but he now begins to form a strategy. And talking to the king, this strategy begins to tumble out. Let's just look back there a little bit at the context of how he came into the presence of the king. It says right at the end of chapter 1 in verse 11, "Now I was the cupbearer to the king." To be a cupbearer in the king's court is an extremely responsible and trusted position, because the role of the cupbearer is to taste the wine before the king has a chance to do so. Why? Well, in case someone has put some poison in it. So the cupbearer is laying his life down potentially for the king, for his master. And very often that role would be given to a relation, someone in the family who could be particularly trusted. But here we learn something about Nehemiah's character, because he is not a member of the king's family, he's not a member of the king's culture or nation. He is living in a foreign country. And yet he's clearly demonstrated his faithfulness, and he's been given this very important and trusted position of being cupbearer to the king. And so as he comes out of this season of prayer and fasting, he comes in front of the king, that's King Artaxerxes, and he says, "I took up the wine and I gave it to the king." That's in verse 1 of chapter 2. "And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, though you're not sick?' There's nothing but sadness of heart." You see, he had a burden. Out of this time of prayer and repentance, he had a burden. And he was showing that on his face as he went into the presence of the king. And yet the king expects his servants to be cheerful and not to be looking glum, not to be looking as though their minds are somewhere else. He wants them to be concentrating on the job in hand. And he says this is nothing but sadness of heart. And Nehemiah's response was, "I was very much afraid." He doesn't want to displease the king. The king has power over life and death. He doesn't want to displease him. And so I said to the king, verse 3, "Let the king live forever. Well, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" And so he shares what is on his heart. He shares the pain and the anguish that is on his heart. And the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." And at that point, the things that had stirred in his heart are spoken out. It's rather like a pregnancy and the birth. That suddenly the baby is born, the vision is spoken, it's out, and he can't recover it. And notice how he prayed to God and spoke to the king. And this, incidentally, is one of the great values of the gift of speaking in tongues. That while we're speaking to someone, we can also be praying inwardly to God. So we're tapped into God as we speak to a colleague or to someone in need. And so he defines the resources that he needs, because the king then said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" And so it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. So he gets the time, and then he said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah." And so he begins to spell out the resources that he needs. He needs letters. And if we read on, we find that he gets more than letters. He gets a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. It reminds one, doesn't it, of the passages in Genesis where Joseph has favor with God, and so Potiphar and the nation have favor because his God is with him, the scripture says. And here we find, because the good hand of my God was on me. So Nehemiah had found favor with the king because he had favor with God. And so he sets out, and he arrives in Jerusalem. It's a long, long way. He arrives in Jerusalem, and in chapter 2 and verse 12 we read, "And I rose in the night, I and a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well, and on to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were consumed by fire." And so he's confirming what it is that his brother Hanani had told him. He said that the walls were broken down and they were burned. He's now having a look for himself. He's beginning to assess the measure of the problem. How big is this problem? "And I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again and returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. Nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work." See, there were many people of the Jews already living in Jerusalem. They had first gone back there some 80 to 90 years before. And so generations had built up in Jerusalem, and they had started to build the temple, then it had stopped. Then the city had been ransacked about 10 years before. And so you find this community there, which would have had its own leaders, it had its own government. Artaxerxes had allowed that. And so we find here a community, and Nehemiah is coming in from outside. Who is he? Well, we know him by name, but he's never lived here. He's never experienced what we've gone through. Indeed, he's been living in the courts of the king, we hear. That's a nice, comfortable place to be, isn't it? And so he didn't tell the officials what was on his heart, what was on his mind. He had to sell his vision to them. And so he gathers them together in verses 17 and 18. Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we're in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. Well, he wasn't telling them anything they didn't know. Way back at the beginning of chapter 1, the very message that Hananiah had brought to him was, the walls are broken down, the walls are burned. And so Nehemiah's not telling him anything new. And so he gathers these leaders, and this guy who's come in from outside is telling them what they already know. But he then goes on to say, well, come, let's rebuild. Now, they must have been somewhat skeptical. Here's this man who's come from a long way away. He's come from the courts of a king, and he's coming to tell them who have been living here all their lives that he wants to rebuild the walls. And I'm sure there was something of a cynical reaction. Huh, how can you tell us what to do? We've lived here, we know what it's all about. It's a huge city, how can we rebuild the walls? And he obviously sensed that, because he then goes on in verse 18 to say, and I told them how the hand of my God had been favourable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. In other words, he gave a testimony of the ways in which God had been faithful, the way in which he had been faithful to him personally, but also through the king, how the king's favour had been extended to him. And this clearly grabbed the attention of those nobles and lords and leaders whom he had gathered together, because then they said, well, let us arise and build. In other words, through the testimony that Nehemiah shared, they had totally turned round. And they moved from being cynical, who is this person to come and tell us what to do, to being enthusiastic and saying, what are we waiting for? Come, let's rise and rebuild. And so he sold the vision to them. Now that is one of the very important parts of leading a team and of the planning process. To get the whole team on board and to understand the vision. Once you've won that battle, if it is a battle, then you move on together, and all of their thinking, all of their gifting becomes available to you to then fulfill the task. And we find that as we move on, because as the ownership is understood and as faith is released, so the skills can be mobilized. And we move into chapter 3 and find that, verse 1, a gentleman called Eliashib, who was the high priest, he arose with his brothers, the priests, and he built the sheep gate. And they consecrated it, and they hung its doors. And they consecrated the wall to the Tower of the 100 and the Tower of Hananel. And in verse 2, next to him, the men of Jericho built. And next to them, Zaccur, the son of Imri, built. And so on. And so we have some 30 plus verses there, spelling out all the different people that were involved. The skills were mobilized. How were they mobilized? Because the leaders in the city whom Nehemiah had sold the vision to, they would have gone back to their various groupings, their various communities, and they would have shared what it was they were going to do. Nehemiah couldn't communicate that effectively. The people wouldn't have had a clue who he was, so why should we listen? But when their leaders who have now grasped that vision, when they go back to the people, so the people say, well, we're up for it, how can we help? And they don't only mobilize the builders themselves, they mobilize people like the perfumers and the workers in fine gold and so on. Not necessarily the people you would choose to lay bricks and to put up timbers across the gates, But nevertheless, everyone wanted on board. Well, not quite everyone. In verse 5 we find a rather sad story. Moreover to him, the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles did not support the work of their masters. I find that verse very sad. These nobles, who were meant to be setting the example to their people, to their tribe, the Tekoites, they stood back. I wonder why. Were they too proud? Was it they didn't want to get their fine clothes covered in cement? I don't know. But leaders are called to serve. Jesus always led by example. He got down on his hands and knees and he washed the disciples' feet. He led by example. And we find elsewhere in the book of Nehemiah, he led by example. But somehow these nobles didn't. They were too proud. They stood back. Now the grace of God is such that I'm sure they benefited once the walls were up and safe and the city was rebuilt. They would have enjoyed living there. They would have benefited from all of the hard work of the rest of the residents of the city. But they missed out on the joy of being able to tell the stories. Do you remember what it was like when? Do you remember that night the storm came? Do you remember? Etc. They missed out on the richness of the process. Why? Because they were proud. Because they couldn't receive orders. They couldn't receive direction. They stood back from it. But everyone else in this chapter worked hard. And we know, astonishingly, that they built the wall, which was probably about a mile long, would have been very high, would have been wide enough for the soldiers to march along the top, to guard the city and to keep watchmen there. It even had houses built into it. They completed it, we find in chapter 6, in 52 days. That's just over 7 weeks. An extraordinary feat. Even today, with cranes and with bulldozers and with diggers and so on, you would be hard pushed to complete a wall that size in 7 weeks. And yet they did it. Why? Because God was with them. An amazing, wonderful, almost miraculous intervention of God. And they were able to do it by working together. And so we find that the goal is stated, they know where they're going. The strategy is shared, they know how they're going to get there. There was a feasibility study just to make sure that all the detail was in place and they knew what resources they would need. And then the plan was communicated and it was sold to the people, so they had ownership. So where have we got to so far? Well, first of all, we've said that planning is about writing your history in advance. It's being able to get to the end of a particular time period, maybe to an event, maybe to a ministry that's running, and look back and be able to say, okay, this is exactly how we planned it. And you make the plans so that you can do that. There will be changes, inevitably there will be changes. But essentially you're trying to plan towards a goal by thinking what it'll be like standing in that place. Planning leads to greater effectiveness. We get the outcomes that we are after if we plan well. Planning accords to scriptural principles. And so we've laid a foundation. That comes to the end of this part, but in the next part we will look at some planning skills.